Well, the boy was so excited, he ran into the house to tell his dad. And he ran in there and he says, we had a contest at school today and I won 2 tickets to the baseball game. We get to go to the game on Friday. I'm so excited, I can't wait. But the response he got wasn't quite what he expected. His dad said, well, you know, with gas prices nowadays, I mean, that's great you got tickets, but boy, it's going to be expensive to drive down there. And, you know, the food at the stadium, that costs a lot of money. This is going to be an expensive trip. That's what we call a pessimist. I mean, on the positive side, he got free tickets and gets to hang out with his kid. But some people are just glass half empty kind of people. Well, the author of Ecclesiastes has been accused of being a pessimist. On the other hand, some have argued that he is not a pessimist, but a realist. Someone who is looking at life, at everything he can see, and just telling it the way it is without sugarcoating it. So before we jump into the book of Ecclesiastes, let me explain a little bit about what's going on here. First of all, the author. The author is not named, but there are reasons to believe that it was written by Solomon, the son of David, King David, or at least most of it. Someone else may have written the intro and the conclusion. The majority of the book is in the first person. I did this, I looked at this, I did this. But the beginning and the end are in the third person, talking about the preacher or teacher, or he did this, he said this. And so it's possible the beginning and the end are by someone else. Now the book basically asks the question, what's the point of life? Or you could say, what is the meaning of life? And what makes life worth living? He's looking for purpose and significance in life. And then to answer that question, he makes a lot of observations about life. In fact, in chapter 1, verse 13, the beginning of 13, he says, I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. So he says, I'm looking for answers here. I'm going to search this out. And he does life experiments. He tries various things to see if they bring fulfillment. And in his observations, though, are very earthbound, meaning they're very focused on the here and now. In fact, there are a couple phrases that are repeated over and over again. Under the sun or under heaven. In other words, he's talking about what he sees here on earth. These are observations about what happens here on earth. And so because of that, it's very pragmatic. I mean, but at the same time, he holds these observations that he's making in tension with what he knows of God and with spiritual truths that he knows. And sometimes he feels some tension between what he sees happening in the world and the spiritual truth he knows. And he wonders then how they fit together. And one of his favorite words is vanity or futility. Now this word literally means breath or vapor. But it's used figuratively to express emptiness or having no substance. Well, you get that if you've ever gone out in the cold and you breathe, you can see your breath. But how long does it last? Not very long. You see it and then it goes away. It's empty. There's really no substance to it. And so he uses these words, and sometimes he doubles these words up to say like vanity of vanities or futility of futility. And by that he means absolute or complete futility. That is absolutely or completely empty or meaningless. So that brings us to a question. Is it all meaningless? Well, let's read how the book starts. In chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, it says, the words of the preacher or teacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. vanity of vanities, all is vanity. How's that for glass half empty or maybe completely empty? But there are several statements made like this. So let me just sum up these statements for you. In talking about accomplishments in life, he says it's futile, like chasing the wind, because life is just an endless cycle and you have to keep working without end. Then he goes on and he says that talking about being wiser than other people, he says it's like trying to chase the wind. You understand that picture? If you try and grab wind, what happens? There's nothing in your hand. Okay? So he says it's like chasing the wind. The reason here, he says, because the wiser you are, the more you understand, and the more you understand, the more frustrated you get with life because you say, well, that's not the way it should be. And it also, and then in talking about indulging in pleasure, he says it's futile, it's folly, it accomplishes nothing because it just leaves you wanting more. Talking about achievements and possessions, he says it's ultimately profitless, like chasing the wind. He's saying it ultimately is unsatisfying because these things don't last. And you have to keep working and you still want more, even when you get what you get. Talking about the benefits of wisdom, he says that they are ultimately meaningless. They're futile, like chasing the wind, because the wise person and the foolish person both die eventually, and you're forgotten. You won't be remembered. Maybe for a little while, but not for long. Talking about the fruit of labor and hard work, he says this also is futile. Why? Because work is hard. And you're so busy working that you can't enjoy what you have. And when you die, you leave it to someone else. And you don't know if they're going to be wise with what you worked for, all that stuff that you worked for. They get to enjoy it, but they may squander it. And talking about when skillful work becomes a competition, I'm as good as this person, I want to be better than that person. He says it's profitless, like chasing the wind. Working without rest or without someone to share it with, chasing the wind, it's futile. Working hard but not being remembered, profitless, like chasing the wind, because nothing lasts forever. Pursuing great wealth and not being content, he says this continual longing is futile, like chasing the wind, because you're never satisfied. You're always needing more, and you're just trying to grab it. How about acting foolish or partying? He says this kind of folly is also useless, because you might have some fun, but again, it doesn't last, or it doesn't accomplish anything, or you might get yourself in trouble. And so he makes all these observations, and his observations are concluded with this: absolutely futile. All of these things are futile or meaningless. That sounds pretty negative, huh? So, is it all meaningless? Well, I'd say no. But from an earthly focused, under the sun perspective, well, let's ask a few more questions, then we'll get some more perspective, and then we'll come back to the answer. So next question, are we just chasing our tails? You've seen the animals. They just go in circles. Are we just chasing our tails? Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. He says, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. He's saying that life just goes on. And people are born and people die and the world keeps spinning. The world just keeps moving on. Verse 5. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. So day after day, year after year, the same thing happens. Now we can look at it and say, well, it's a good thing that the sun rises every day, right? It is. But he's saying, look, it's just the same thing every day. Verse 6 and 7. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north, and around goes the wind, and on its circuit the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. So he's saying everything just goes in a cycle. Because, it'll rain, and that rain then gathers into streams and rivers and then runs to the ocean, and then what happens? It evaporates, and then it rains, and then it runs. It's what we call the water cycle, right? That just happens. And he's just saying that it all just keeps going. It doesn't go anywhere. It's just always the same. Verse 8. He says, all things are full of weariness, and man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor ear filled with hearing. He's saying, you always want more. No matter how much you get, you always want more, and it just keeps going. You've never experienced enough. You've never seen enough or heard enough. It's like saying, well, that was great. Now what's next? So you're always wanting more. Verse 9, he says, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has been already. It has been already in the ages before us. He's saying there's nothing new. And even when we have something that we call new, it's just a new way of doing an old thing. It's just, we're just doing the same thing a different way. He says it's all been done before, and here we go again. Okay, turn over to chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 1. Some of this may sound familiar to you. It says, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under the sun. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Turn, 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 if you know the old song. He says there's a time for everything. So everything has its place. It's right time. And so we're living life, and all of these things are just a regular part of life. And so we do this, and then we do that, and then we do this, and then we do that. Everything has its place. Keep reading though, verse 9. He says, what gain has the worker for his toil? I have seen the busyness that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. So he says, in some ways, it may seem like we're just going round and round and getting nowhere. But he says, but life is ordered by God. He has put everything in its right place and its right time. And we may not be able to understand it all, but God ultimately is in control. And so this brings us to the next question. Can we enjoy life? Well, look at chapter 3, verse 9. We just saw it. And he had said, what gain has the worker for his toil? And then in verse 10 and 11, he said, well, God ordered life. But then he comes to this conclusion, verse 12. He says, I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is a gift. This is God's gift to man. Keep reading verse 14. He says, I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it. Nothing can be taken away from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. You see, it's actually a good thing that the world keeps turning, right? Otherwise, life would stop. It's a good thing that the world keeps turning. It's a good thing that the water cycle repeats. And it's a good thing that life goes on. But it does it because God created it that way and because he's in control. And so there may be some monotony to life, but you're alive. And there are good times. And so enjoy life. He tells us here, enjoy your work. It's all a gift from God. See, God has given us the ability to work, and he's given us good times, and he's given us seasons to enjoy. So enjoy these things. Turn back to chapter 2, verses 24 and 26, 24 through 26. He says, there is nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the busyness of gathering and collecting, only to give to one who pleases God. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. So here he's saying that work may be hard, it's toil, but you can enjoy it. And God has given you the ability to enjoy it. But we also see in here the idea that there's more to life for those who are in a relationship with God. He says that God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy. And apart from God, you have the monotony, and you have the task of chasing after wealth, which, as we already said, never satisfies. You never have enough. Turn over to chapter 5 and verse 18. Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun the few days of his life that God has given him. For this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil. This is the gift of God. For he will not much remember the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. In other words, he's not going to remember the hard things so much because there's enough of life going on and you're going to remember you have joy. But he's saying here to enjoy what you're doing. Enjoy the fruit of your labor. Everything you have is a gift from God. God has given it to you to enjoy. So along with that, though, in chapter 6, verse 9, he says, better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. He's saying it's better to enjoy what you see, what you have, than to always be wanting more, to have that appetite that's just craving. In other words, not being content. So he said, so be content. Enjoy what you have, be content with what you have, because if you're always looking for more, then you forget to enjoy what you have. And so can we enjoy life? Absolutely. And you should. Recognize the gift that God has given you and live with joy. Next question, though. Is there benefit from being wise and righteous? Turn back to chapter 2, verse 13 to 16. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceived that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For of the wise as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. And so first he says, well, having wisdom is better than being foolish, because it's like walking in the light rather than the dark. You know, like if you get up at night, if you turn on the light, you can see the Legos or the corner of the dresser. but when you don't turn on the light, you step on the Legos and you kick the corner of the dresser. All right? He says, having wisdom is like having a light on. All right? Being foolish is like walking in the dark. And so you have eyes in your head. You can see what you're doing. And so he says there is benefit. It's better to be wise than foolish. Life is better because you can make better decisions with better consequences when you're wise. But then he wonders if this ultimately makes a difference, though, because both the wise person and the fool ultimately die and then are forgotten. Now, this is one of the areas that I think Solomon was a little nearsighted in his conclusions, because he couldn't prove the afterlife. See, these are all observations, things that he could see in the world. He couldn't prove the afterlife through observation. You could see people born, you could see people die, but you couldn't see beyond that. So he couldn't prove the afterlife through his observation, and he didn't yet have the full revelation of God. And so he wasn't sure what happened when you die, after you die. Of course, now we have God's full revelation, and it's very clear that when we die, that we will live on one way or another. We will be raised for judgment or for eternal life. And we know that Jesus came and died on the cross to pay this price for our sins so that everyone who believes in him can be forgiven and have eternal life. And so we know that for sure now. But Solomon several times says, who knows? Chapter 3, verse 16 and 17. He says, moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness. And in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. Now, the main point being made here is that even though there is injustice where there should be justice, even though there is injustice in the world and things that are done wrong in the world, that God is just, and at some point he will judge and he will make things right. But there's an important implication in this, because he says he will judge both the righteous and the wicked. Being righteous is better than wicked because God is going to judge. And who do you think will have it better? The righteous, those who do what God says. Chapter 5, verse 1. He says, guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore, in other words, he's higher than you. Therefore, let your words be few. For a dream comes with much busyness, and a fool's voice with many words. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before the messenger or before the priest that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity. But God is the one you must fear. So first in these verses, he was talking about empty worship. And he's saying, don't just go through the motions of worship without truly worshiping from the heart. Or don't go through the actions without listening to hear from God. But then he talks about making rash vows. And he says, don't just say a bunch of words that you don't mean. Don't make vows or promises to God that you don't intend to keep or that you can't keep. Instead, he says, you need to fear God. In other words, revere him. Recognize who he is, who are you talking to, and speak to him and treat him with deep respect as he deserves. And so there is great benefit from being wise and being righteous, because it will protect you from God's judgment. Well, he talks a lot more about being wise and righteous versus being foolish and wicked. But we don't have time to get into all of it. But there is one more section of verses I want to look at. Look at chapter 10, beginning with verse 10. Chapter 10, verse 10, he says, if the iron is blunt, referring to like an iron axe head, if the iron is blunt, one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength. But wisdom helps one to succeed. In other words, if you're wise, you would sharpen the axe and it doesn't take as much effort. All right? So he just says, hey, it's easier if you're wise. Life will be easier. Things will be easier. Jump down to verse 12. He says, the words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. And fools multiply words. In other words, they just keep talking. Fools multiply words, though no man knows what it is to be. And who can tell him what will be after him? And then jump in verse 15, it says, the toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. He's saying a foolish person doesn't know what he's doing. He keeps working, but he has no idea where he's headed or what he's doing. He doesn't know how to do what he's doing, but he does it anyways. And so it's just harder because he just chasing his tail. He's spinning his wheels. He's just doing things without really knowing how to do it. And so it's a lot harder. And so he's saying that wisdom makes life easier. Wisdom makes you more productive. It will help you be successful. And it helps you win favor with people. In other words, wisdom helps people like you. Because you act in a way that they will appreciate, and it helps people think more highly of you. But foolishness, on the other hand, leads to more foolishness and is really self-destructive. And so is there benefit to being wise and righteous? Well, yes, there is. So, should we work hard and pursue goals in this life? Or, if it's all meaningless and empty, should we just blow it off and be lazy and not have goals? Well, we already saw that working hard is, he says, the best thing that we have. And we should enjoy it. That it brings accomplishment and enjoyment. But let's look at a few other verses. Chapter 10, verse 18. He says, through sloth or laziness, the roof sinks in. Talking about the roof of your house. If it's falling apart and you do nothing, it falls in. And through indolence or idle hands doing nothing, the house leaks. All right, he's just using a very simple illustration here. If you do nothing, nothing gets done. If you're lazy and you don't work or pursue goals, you end up doing nothing, and then it even brings trouble on you, because you can even lose what you have. Because you don't fix the hole in your roof, it falls in. And here's an interesting proverb. Turn back to chapter 9 and verse 4. It says, but he who is joined with all the living has hope, for a living dog is better than a dead lion. All right? At this time, dogs weren't thought very highly of. Nowadays, people love their dogs. But at this time, they were thought of as filthy scavengers, because that's what they were. So dogs were not thought very highly of. But lions, on the other hand, they were respected because they were powerful animals. All right? But here he says, but a live dog is better than a dead lion. In other words, it's better to be alive, no matter who you are. He says it's better to be alive. He's saying now is the time to live and enjoy life. Why? Because you're alive. So now's your time. Live and enjoy life. But he builds on these ideas. Chapter 11, starting in verse 1. He says, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or 8, even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. Now we read this and that's very confusing. You're like, what in the world is he talking about? Throw your bread or your grain out on the water and it'll come back. He's talking about investing and business, doing business. So the idea is you send your bread or your grain out on the water, on the ships that cross the waters, and you'll make money. So you send it out to sell it, and you make money. So he's talking about investing here. But then he also says, he's saying to spread out your investments. He's give it to 7 or 8. In other words, diversify. We heard people talking about diversifying, right? You diversify because you don't know what will happen. This one may go under. This one may do very well. So diversify your investments. And so he's saying just be wise about that and spread out your investments because you don't know what will happen. But don't just do nothing. He continues on verse 3. He says, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where a tree falls, there it will lie. These are just common sense statements. If there are storm clouds, what happens? It rains. If a tree falls down, it doesn't stand back up. Okay? It just lays there where it falls. And so in the same way, verse 4, he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. He's saying if you wait for the perfect weather, you'll never do anything. You'll never accomplish anything because you can always find a reason to not work. Or you could just go out and work. Verse 5 and 6. He says, as you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child. In other words, we don't know exactly, how does a baby form inside a womb? So you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. He's saying that we don't know everything, and we don't understand how some things work. So but you could use that as an excuse to not work then. Well, I don't know if the wind's going to blow here. I better not throw out my seed. It might blow away. So we could use that as an excuse to do nothing, or we could work and just keep moving forward in hopes of succeeding. Verse 9. He says, rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. You see, when you're young, in many ways, life is easier. You have strength and energy. You pursue your goals, and you do the things that you want to accomplish. But at the same time, you need to remember that God will judge. And this is an important qualification. It's because Solomon here is saying, follow your heart. Chase your dreams. Pursue your goals. But if we're following our hearts, Jeremiah tells us that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. In other words, our hearts can mislead us. Our desires can mislead us. So what we're saying here is pursue your goals, but remember that you're accountable to God and remain obedient to God. Chapter 12, verse 1. It says, remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. He's saying, so when life is easier, remember God. Don't forget God. He says there's coming a day when life is going to be hard. Continues on, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain. It's talking about life getting difficult. In that day when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men are bent. In other words, when we get older, what happens? Even strong people get weaker. It continues on, and the grinders cease. Teeth. You lose your teeth, so you can't chew. Because they are few, and those who look through the windows are dimmed. Talking about your eyes. I understand this. I'm getting older. My eyes are getting worse. All right? This is the way it goes. He says, when the sounding of grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird. Now, I know some older people who say anything can wake them up. It gets to a point where it's like the slightest little noise, like the chirping of a bird, can wake you up, and then you can't get back to sleep. Okay? So the daughters of the song are brought low. They are afraid also of what is high, and terrors are in the way. In other words, just moving around gets difficult. You're afraid of falling. The almond tree blossoms, your hair turns gray or white. The grasshopper drags himself along, so the grasshopper, he's used to jumping and stuff, and it gets to the point where I can't just jump like I used to. And desire fails because man is going to his eternal home, and the mourners go about in the street. In other words, it gets to the point where one day you'll die. The point? So enjoy life and work and pursue your goals as long as you can. Do it now when you're able to. So enjoy life, work, pursue your goals as long as you can. But don't forget God in the process. So what is the final answer? It seems like Solomon here gives us a bit of mixed ideas. He's struggling with what he observes in the world and what he knows for sure of God and what he doesn't know for certain. I think when we read Ecclesiastes, it's kind of like Job's friends in the book of Job. You know, when Job's friends, they gathered there and they talked to Job and they gave him advice and they said a lot of things. And they said some things that were really good. I mean, good theology. They said some things that were not so good theology. They applied some of that theology wrongly. And so there's some things that were there kind of, and I think there's a little bit of that type of thing going on here in Ecclesiastes where Solomon is struggling with some of these things. And so, but what conclusions does he come to from his observations? Well, he says that life is good and you can enjoy it and you should work hard and you should try to succeed. But the fact that all people will die and be forgotten frustrates him, especially because he's not sure about the afterlife. And so he says then ultimately it's meaningless. But then we come to the end of the book and the final answer. Look at chapter 12, verses 8 to 14. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. My son, beware of anything beyond these, of making many books. There is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Now, my view is that this is a different author here at the end of the book. That he took Solomon's writings and he wrapped them all up and he points us in the right direction. And he gives us the final answer. And so he says that the preacher or the teacher was wise and that he carefully studied everything and that he evaluated what he could see in this world. That he collected wise and helpful sayings and proverbs. But then he says that this is good for us. He says they're like goads or prods. You know, what that basically a sharp stick that you could poke cattle with to get them to move. So he says that these are things to help get us moving. That they help us think through these things. They prod us to move. They urge us to think through these things in life and then to live well. But then there's a warning also. And his warning is that you can get lost in the weeds here, so to speak. And you can wear yourself out with trying to know everything or to keep up with every new book that is written, every new idea that comes along. When I was in seminary, at one point I learned enough that I realized there was a whole lot I didn't know. And the more I learned, the more I started to get frustrated. Because I'm like, how am I ever going to know all of these things? I mean, I had all these professors teaching me these things. I'm like, how am I going to understand all of this and gather all of this? And then one day it hit me. I realized that each one of those professors specialized in a certain area. So they didn't all know everything. But see, trying to know everything, you can just wear yourself out. Then we come to the final answer. I'm going to read that again, verse 13 and 14. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So whatever else you know, whatever else you do in life, fear God and obey him. Revere him. Live with the reality of God before you at all times, recognizing who he is and honor him. Live with God in his rightful place in your life and live how he says to live. He says, for this is the whole duty of man. In other words, this is your number one responsibility in life. This is the most important thing in your life. Or, if it's not, then you're missing it. So we can talk about work and goals and enjoying life and being wise, and all of that is good. But the foremost issue in life is my relationship with God. This is what ultimately makes life worth living. Now, let me just make a few applications for us here. First, work hard at what you do. Pursue your goals, try to be successful, and try to make a difference in the world. But don't forget God in the process. In fact, keep him first in your life. If you don't, then your life is out of order. Secondly, the wise person and the foolish person do both die. But that's not the end. Those who believe in Jesus have eternal life and reward from God. God created us to have a relationship with him. Our sin broke that relationship, cut us off from God, but Jesus came and died on the cross to pay the price for our sin so that we could be forgiven and made right with God. And God's word says, believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved. You'll be reconciled, brought back into a right relationship with God. This death in this life is not the end. But the way to eternal life is through believing in Jesus. Third application. it's not all about me. And it's not all about my legacy. Life is about honoring God. Life is about living for Him and doing what is right for His glory. And lastly, life is not meaningless. But true meaning in life is found in a relationship with God. It's found in living for God. You know people who are searching for significance and searching for meaning in life. You've seen it. People will pour themselves into things like their kids or their job or some social issue or their hobby or any number of things. And those aren't necessarily bad things. And you can find some meaning in those things, but none of them will last forever, and they don't ultimately satisfy. There's only one thing that can fully satisfy your heart's deepest longings, and that's a relationship with God. So like I said, you know people who are searching for significance and meaning in life? Well, you know the answer. Don't keep it to yourself. So the conclusion, fear God and keep His commandments. Fear God and keep His commandments. This is our ultimate purpose. This is what will truly satisfy. This is what makes life truly worth living.